All right, here we go. It's time to talk about David Hume, uh, the Enquiry, sections 5 and 7. And also today, I want to take time to respond to various student comments on Hume's Enquiry, section 4. I hope all of y'all are doing well back at home. Maybe some of you are living on campus, I don't know. I've studied the various comments that I received from students in Group B. And I'm not going to have time to respond to all of them. I'm sorry about that. But I'll try to fit in responses to 4 different students. And then I do want to go on to talk about at least some of the things that happen in sections 5 and 7 of David Hume's Inquiry. Keep in mind that for our next class meeting, which will be on Monday, or the next online lecture, I will want you to have read Hume's Inquiry Section 8. I will talk about Hume's Inquiry Section 8 next time. And those of you in Group C, I will want you guys to write a sort of critical response to things that Hume says in Section 5 and Section 7 of the Inquiry. I'll send you guys an email today with the things that you need to be taken care of for Monday. But let us get into some of the student comments regarding Section 4, and then we'll turn to Hume's Inquiry, Sections 5 and 7. Thought maybe I'd start here by looking at something that Autumn Klein wrote in her short assignment, and I'll try to address this. Hopefully I can do justice to what she says here. I'll just read a little excerpt from Klein's essay. Autumn Klein says, well, first of all, Autumn Klein points out that Hume makes this distinction between relations of ideas, which are necessary truths, and they are conceptual, and we can know them just by understanding the concepts involved in them. And then Hume says that there are matters of fact, which are not necessary truths. Their contraries are possible, and they must be known through experience, and they're all based on cause and effect, says Hume in Section 4. Autumn Klein writes, and I quote from Autumn Klein, matters of fact aren't truly cause and effect. They are more so observations one has repeatedly over time. Although the example of hitting windows with rocks causing them to break would be cause and effect, as the rock causes the windows to break, the fact that there is a television set in the room and the fact that the earth revolves around the sun are both observations. Right? Autumn Klein goes on and says the fact that matters of fact are not solely cause and effect relationships would then disprove the first point in the main argument of Section 4, that all beliefs concerning matters of fact are based on causal reasoning. And I want to respond to this. Autumn, I don't think this critique of Hume's going to work. And here's why. Consider your example of the television set is in the room, or there is a television set in the room. In fact, there's a television set in my room, just over here. But look, that claim, it is based on cause and effect. What leads me to conclude that there's a television set in the room? Well, what leads me to conclude this is I have the impression, I have the perception of a television set. I conclude that there is a television set in the room based on my impression, right? And that conclusion, though, is based on the presumption that there is, in fact, something that is the material physical television set causing the impression that I have of the television set. So my conclusion that there's a television set in the room, it is based on causal thinking. I've got the impression of the television set, and then I conclude the television set is there on the presumption that there is the physical object causing the impression. And I would say similar things about the conclusion or the claim that the earth revolves around the sun. It too is causal. What leads me to believe that there is a thing that is the sun around which the earth revolves? Again, I've got the impression of a fiery orb that we reference as the sun. And based on that impression, I conclude that there is a thing that is the sun. And that's built into the assertion that the earth revolves around the sun. Additionally, there is causality at work in justifying the conclusion that the earth revolves around the sun. It's the presumption that the earth revolves around the sun. That presumption is justified because it plays a better role in causally explaining various astronomical data that we have observed. So the earth revolves around the sun. That too is grounded on causal assumptions. And so I don't think we can treat the assertion there is a television set in the room or the assertion the earth revolves around the sun. I don't think we can justifiably say that those are non-causal. And so at least at this point, I don't think we have good reason to deny Hume's assertion that all matter of facts claims are grounded on cause and effect. So that's what I would want to say in defense of Hume against Autumn Klein's critical reflections. Let's move on. I think I'll talk. Let's turn to something that Zachary Morris has said. And one of the things that, let's read Zachary Morris. Zachary Morris, he raises a criticism which I've often heard over the years. And I do think the critical point he makes, it is answerable in Hume's defense. Let me quote a paragraph from Zachary Morris. He writes, "Something about Hume's argument makes me a bit skeptical," says Zachary Morris. And again, I'm reading from Morris. "It has to do with his assertion that the matters of fact that we know about the past and present will not apply to the future. While it is true that a lot of things that we know through experience are not always reliable or true, I think that there are certain principles that we can find through advanced study and apply to the future. Hume talks about bread and its secret power to provide nourishment to us, and how there could be a very similar piece of bread in the future that does not possess this power, and that we can only know whether or not it can nourish through experience. But through the study of human bodies and the structure of bread, other nourishing substances, I believe that we can have the knowledge to know if something will be nourishing or not before we eat it. That does not rely on actually eating that piece of bread in question. By studying past nourishing substances, I think we can find out what makes it nourishing and use this to analyze future pieces of potential food. Hume asks if anyone can possibly know why one thing is nourishing to a man but not a tiger. And I say that it is possible to know." And that ends the quote from Zachary Morris. Now, the students have often raised this issue, and I think students raise the issue, right? Because again, as Zachary's comments point out, Hume uses that example of how, people have eaten bread in the past and they've got nourishment from it, and then they've eaten bread again and they've got nourishment from it, and they've eaten bread again and they got nourishment again, and then people draw the conclusion that eating bread provides nourishment to human beings. And Hume says, but we're at a loss to understand the secret powers which necessitates the nourishment upon eating the bread. And a lot of times students say, oh, well, Hume's just writing in the 18th century. And if Hume had only know about the path that science would follow, and we discovered that there were certain vitamins and minerals and carbohydrates in the bread that provide nourishment, well, then Hume wouldn't be saying these things if he was more informed about science. Science today can tell us that there are vitamins and minerals and carbohydrates in the bread that provides nourishment to the human body. So sometimes people think that Hume's arguments based on some sort of lack of understanding of the advancement of science, but I don't think Hume's made a mistake here. And I think that even if we understand the advancement of science, Hume's argument still has teeth. Because after all, even though, right, we may come to discover, even though we may come to discover that what's in the bread that provides the nourishment is certain vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates, right? Even if we discover that those are the secret powers in the bread, it's Hume's argument still holds here, right? Because right now, right. So suppose we discover those secret powers, and then we learn that it's the consumption of those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates in the bread, which nourishes the human being. But even that conclusion itself is grounded on evidence from the past. Person one consumed those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates, and he was nourished. Person two consumed those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates, and he was nourished. Person three consumed those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates, and he was nourished, right? But now to justify the claim that those secret powers of vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates nourish, to justify the claim that there's a causal relation between the consumption of the vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates and the nourishing, to justify that claim presumes that we must have seen these things happen in the past, and then we also have to presume that the future will resemble the past, right? But now we're just back to Hume's critique of causation. Because while we know that consuming those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates in the past has provided nourishment, there's still, right, to justify the causal claim, we have to presume that whenever those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates are consumed, they will provide nourishment in the future. That requires the assumption that the future will resemble the past. But what justifies the presumption that the future will resemble the past? It's not definitionally true that the future will resemble the past. It's not something that we know by relations of ideas, right? And so if it's not definitionally true that the future will resemble the past, then we must know that the future will resemble the past based on empirical evidence. But we can have no empirical evidence of the future. The future has not arrived. And if I cannot empirically justify the claim that the future will resemble the past, and if it's not definitionally true, there's really no justification for the claim that the future will resemble the past. And so even though I know that people have always been nourished by the consumption of those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates in the past, it doesn't follow that we'll continue to be nourished by the consumption of those in the future. And so the causal claim that eating those vitamins and minerals and carbohydrates will nourish is unjustified, right? Because to say that X causes Y means that whenever X occurs, Y will occur. And so to say that eating those vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates nourishes presumes that when I eat them in the future, it will nourish. But there's no way to justify that because I've got no evidence that the future will resemble the past. So, that's how I think Hume's going to respond to Zach Morris's critique. And Zach, I'm glad you bring that up. In fact, I'm very, in general, I'm quite pleased with the essays I've been getting in critical response to things that Hume is saying, even though, I'm doing my gosh darndest to give Humean defenses. I think you guys are doing a good job. So anyway, let's go on. Let's take a look at, I've got something from Caleb Rigdon here. Let's consider Rigdon's point. Rigdon, he's also got a critical reply to Hume. Rigdon writes the following. Rigdon says, astrophysics and physics are both sciences based on the relations of ideas. Extremely advanced mathematical formulas are involved. There is a mathematical formula out there that shows all the math explaining why the sun rises every 24 hours, or how exactly the pin is affected by gravity. If math is a relation of ideas, then why can't the answers to the world math gives us also be relations of ideas, and therefore be rationally justified? Sure, these ideas in their simplest forms may be matters of fact. I see the sun rise every day, therefore I assume it'll rise tomorrow. But someone much smarter than me can, in fact, break most things down into mathematical relations of ideas. We see that these relations of ideas are true, too. Otherwise, we would not have done things like send men to the moon, satellites to space, etc. The success of those things relied on the math being right. And since they succeeded, the math must have been right. End quote from Rigdon. You know, I must say, I think I understand what Caleb's talking about here. I'll give an interpretation to what Caleb is pushing, and then I want to respond in Hume's defense. I take Rigdon to be saying that we can use mathematical formulas to make reliable predictions of how material objects will behave. And this has enabled us to land spaceships on the moon, to put man on the moon, to put satellites into space and to use them, etc. And I take Rigdon to be suggesting here that maybe this means that our knowledge of matters of fact is really a kind of relations of ideas and thereby rationally justified. So perhaps I take Rigdon to be suggesting that we can rationally justify our beliefs concerning matters of fact insofar as mathematical formulas can be applied to explaining and predicting the behavior of material objects, such as the motions of the moon, the earth, the stars, satellites, what have you. Now, what I want to say in response to this is that these mathematical formulas that are applied to the behavior of moving objects, such as the earth, the sun, the moon, the planets, these mathematical formulas that are used in physics to explain the behavior of physical objects, well, these formulas are developed and applied to the behavior and motion of physical objects on the basis that physical objects will move and operate in the future in the ways that they have moved and operated in the past. Right? Mathematical formulas expressed by physicists like and astronomers like Galileo and Sir Isaac Newton, those formulas, right, are developed on past observations of how material objects have moved and operated and how planets have moved and operated in the past. And those mathematical formulas that are generated in physics to explain and predict the way that physical objects and planets and the moon will operate in the future, they're based, right? Those formulas are based on assumptions of how those objects have acted in the past. And when we apply those formulas to make predictions about how planets and the moon will behave in the future, well, those predictions are based on the presumption that those objects, whether planets or the moon or other physical objects, those predictions that we make using the mathematical formulas, they're based on the presumption that the future will resemble the past. And as long as we presume that the future will resemble the past, those mathematical formulas will let us predict with great accuracy how things will operate in the future. However, the presumption that the future will resemble the past is not something that's true by definition, right? There's nothing in the concept of the future that requires that it resemble the past, and there's nothing in the concept of the past that requires that the future will resemble it. It's not definitionally true that the future will resemble the past, right? And if it's not definitionally true, right? The only way that we could know that the future will resemble the past, the only way that we could justify that claim, if it's not definitionally true, is through empirical evidence. But we don't have empirical evidence of the future. We haven't gotten to the future yet to see it. So we have to presume the future will resemble the past without any evidence. And so even though mathematical formulas have enabled us to put man on the moon, those formula were used and applied on an unjustified presumption that the future will resemble the past. And in this way, I guess Hume might want to say, well, it all worked out. But at some level, there wasn't rational justification at some level for the presumption that the future will resemble the past. But human beings, as we see in Section 5 and Section 7 of the Enquiry, Hume just says that, luckily, this human and innate and non-rational tendency to presume that the future will resemble the past, it serves us well. And it has served us well in the past. Hume thinks we're all inclined and naturally inclined to believe it will serve us well in the future. Boy, I've already gone 21 minutes. There is more that I'd like to talk to. I had Laura Naide on the docket, but I think, boy, I'd like to respond to what you've got there too. I think I need to move on. I need to allow time to get to these other things. But anyway, I will hold off from responding to others. All of you, thank you so much. Dallas McFarland, I think you had one in here as well. Daniel, Kim, Naide, I know I haven't gotten to you all today. But let's go on and let's talk about Hume Section 5 and 7, because I don't want to fall too far behind. Let us go ahead and talk about Section 5 and 7. I don't know how much I'll have to add to what you see in the outline, but let's just walk through this. Section 5, what's going on here, right? And keep in mind, what has gone on before. Hume, again, in Section 4, he's argued that all knowledge is either this definitionally true relations of ideas that can be known and understood just by understanding the concepts involved in these things that are definitionally true, such as 2 + 2 = 4, all squares are four-sided figures, etc. And then there's matters of fact, and these are not necessary truths, and they're not conceptual truths. To know matters of fact requires empirical evidence, and their contraries possible. These are contingent truths, matters of fact. And Hume, as you all know, right, Hume raises serious doubts about whether we can give rational justification for our belief in matters of fact. Hume is well aware that we're all going to continue to believe in matters of fact. We're all going to continue to believe that when the pin is released into the air on Earth, it will fall down. We're all going to continue to believe that when getting kicked really hard in the shin by people like Zach Morris, we're going to feel pain. Things like this. We're going to continue to believe that when water is subjected to 212 degrees Fahrenheit temperature at 1 atmospheric pressure, it's going to boil, etc. We're all going to continue to believe in these causal relations. But Hume's point is that it doesn't really seem to have a rational foundation, these causal claims, because they're all based on this presumption that the future will resemble the past when we have no empirical evidence of the future. Now, in Section 5, Hume wants to talk about, why we are led to believe in causal relations and why we're led to believe that the future will resemble the past, things like this. Well, let's look at Section 5. In section, right, and maybe I've been getting ahead of myself. Let's go to the outline. I start out by saying that, look, in Section 4, Hume argues that our beliefs concerning matters of fact are not and cannot be rationally justified. They cannot be based in reason. But we do form all kinds of beliefs concerning matters of fact. Not all our beliefs are relations of ideas, expressions of conceptual truth. This raises the question then, what does lead us to believe in matters of fact? Right? If the beliefs in matters of fact are not rationally justifiable, what leads us to believe in them? Well, Hume's answer is that ultimately it is custom or habit, right? Hume says that having experienced certain events, say X and Y, being constantly conjoined in the past, we are by custom or habit instinctively led to believe that the earlier event X causes the latter event Y. Therefore, seeing the one event X in the future, we are led to assume that Y will follow. Right? So, for instance, we've seen repeatedly objects released into the air on our planet and they're falling. Right? We see a constant conjunction in the past of object released, object falling, object released, object falling. Right? And on Hume's view, our mind is structured in such a way that when we see a constant conjunction between events such as objects released, object falling, object released, object falling, our minds are naturally and instinctively led to expect the one event, the falling, to be followed by the releasing. For example, as I have in my notes, having been pinched and subsequently pinched, yow, right? Having been pinched and subsequently felt pain many times in the past, experiencing these as constantly conjoined in my past experience, my mind is naturally led to assume that pinching causes pain. Thus, I assume that any subsequent pinching, any pinching in the future, will lead to my being pained in the future, right? So I'm sitting there talking, and Naide's getting tired of listening to me to drone on as she reaches over with her fingers like this. She's about to pinch the crap out of me, and I pull my arm away because I believe, having been pinched many times in the past, that I'm going to feel pain when she pinches me now. Hume's point is that since our thoughts, I'm back to my outline, since our thoughts concerning cause and effect are controlled by this instinctual formation of beliefs after experiencing constantly conjoined events, and since our beliefs concerning matters of fact are based on causal thinking, our beliefs concerning matters of fact are instinctual, based on custom or habit. I had here page 339. Is there something I want to quote here? Hume writes on page 339, about 12 lines from the bottom, I quote from Hume, he says, all these operations are a species of natural instincts, which no reasoning or process of the thought and understanding is able either to produce or to prevent. Right? All these operations, all of this causal thinking, all this believing that one thing can cause another, releasings of pins where gravity is operational can cause it to fall, pinchings of Lamos real hard can cause him pain, subjecting water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit at 1 atmospheric pressure will cause it to boil. All these causal operations are species of natural instincts which no reasoning or process of the thought and understanding is able either to produce or to prevent. Reason can't tell us that the future will resemble the past, right? Reason can't tell us that the future will resemble the past. And reason can't tell us to stop in the presumption that the future will resemble the past, because the human mind is structured in such a way that when we see events constantly conjoined in our past experience, such as pinchings and painings, droppings and fallings, our minds are made such that, and our minds are designed such that we instinctively presume that there's a causal relationship when we see events constantly conjoined in our past experience. Reason doesn't lead us to make those beliefs about causal relations. Reason doesn't lead to it. Instinct does. And reason can't make us stop engaging in the causal beliefs. Our minds are going to continue on doing this. So, right, for Hume, There's a lot going on in the mind that's just instinctual, not rational, that our minds are going to continue to do. We're going to continue to think that the sun will rise tomorrow. We're going to continue to think that when things are released into the air, they will fall, right? But this is all just human instinct. It's not rational. It's just human instinct. But Hume thinks that we're better off having these instinctual beliefs. Notice on my outline, I got here, we're better off this way, exclamation point. In the later parts of Hume's Enquiry, section 5, David Hume says it is a good thing that our causal thinking is based on instinct and not reason. For reason, he says, is too liable to error and arises in us later in life. Children are not especially reasonable, according to Hume. Fancy that. We need to think causally and to do so reliably, and we need to be able to do this in the early stages of life as children. Children need to be able to make these causal connections so that they won't get hurt or hurt others. Thus, we are better adapted to survive, says Hume, if we are naturally, instinctively led to form beliefs and causal relations between events. I've often found this aspect of Hume's writing very interesting, and I think I've been led to find it very interesting because I've had this long-standing and abiding interest in evolutionary biology and philosophy, and there's this very naturalistic, almost evolutionary nature to the things that David Hume was talking about here. I take Hume to be suggesting that while the belief that the future will resemble the past and the belief in causal relations is not rationally justifiable, but rather it is an instinctive thing that we do when we see events constantly conjoined in our experience in the past. Hume wants to say that it's a good thing that our minds operate this way because reason is untrustworthy and it is adaptive for us. It helps us survive by being able to instinctively form these beliefs and causal relationships and to instinctively presume that the future will resemble the past when we see certain events conjoined in our past experience. And in support of this interpretation, I would just draw your attention to some passages from Hume that have always fascinated me. I'm looking at page 345 of the text. I'm wondering right now, where should I begin this quote? Well, I will start 345, about the middle of the page. Hume writes the following, and he's talking here about the instinctual human capacity to form causal beliefs. Hume writes, "Here then is a kind of pre-established harmony between the course of nature and the succession of our ideas, and though the powers and forces by which the former is governed be wholly unknown to us, yet our thoughts and conceptions have still, we find, gone on in the same train with the other works of nature. Custom is that principle by which this correspondence has been effected, so necessary to the subsistence of our species and the regulation of our conduct in every circumstance and occurrence of human life." Notice this. Custom is that principle by which this correspondence has been effected, and it is necessary to the subsistence, right, of our species and the regulation of our conduct in every circumstance and occurrence of human life. Right? There, Hume's pointing out that it helps us survive and continue the species insofar as we instinctively form the belief in causal relations, insofar as we instinctively believe that the future will resemble the past, right? It is healthy for me, right? I've been pinched and hurt, or using Hume's example, I put my hand in the fire, been burned, ow, ow, right? Every time my hand goes in the fire. And, experiencing that constantly conjunction between hand and fire, pain, hand and fire, pain. And now I instinctively believe that when I put my hand in the fire in the future, I'm going to feel pain too. And the formation of that belief, it's instinctive, right? And Hume's saying it helps us survive and right? And helps the species continue on. Right? Hume goes on, still 345, about 6 lines from the bottom. Hume says, I shall add for a further confirmation of the foregoing theory that as this operation of the mind, the instinctive urge to form causal judgments, as this operation of the mind by which we infer like effects from like causes and vice versa is so essential to the subsistence of all human creatures, it is not probable that it could be trusted to the fallacious deductions of our reason, which is slow in its operations, appears not in any degree during the first years of infancy, and at best is in every age and period of human life extremely liable to error and mistake. Right? There you see Hume saying, it's a good thing that we've got this instinctive capacity to form causal connections from our beliefs. It's a good thing that I instinctively infer that when I put my hand in the fire, it will cause pain, right? It's instinctive for me to make these causal relations, right, based on experiencing the fire pain, fire pain, fire pain. Now instinctively I say, well, it must be that whenever I put my hand in the fire, I will feel pain. I draw the conclusion that the fire causes pain. And I do that instinctively, not rationally. But Hume says that's a good thing. It helps us do well at surviving and reproducing. It's what lets the species go on. Hume predates Darwin by many years. We're looking about 50, 60 years. Darwin's writing mid-19th century, but there seem to me to be some significant relations between some of the ideas that's on Hume's mind and things that we see in Darwin with his some of his evolutionary views. I'm not saying that Darwin doesn't bring a hell of a lot to the table that's new. He sure as hell does. But there are some connections there. But anyway, so I don't have more on Section 5. Let us turn to Section 7 for a bit. Here, Hume is led to tell us more about the notion of cause and the notion of necessary connections between events, right? And here, Hume, in this chapter, right, Hume wants to explain how we come to get the idea of cause or necessary connection. Hume's very interested in talking about the impression, the perception, right, from which we derive the idea of cause or necessary connection. How do we get the idea of there being a necessary connection, a causal relation between, say, hand in fire and feeling pain, hand in fire and feeling pain? How do we get the idea of there being a necessary connection or a causal relation between hand put in fire and the feeling of pain? Or how do we get the idea of there being a necessary connection between the releasing of pin on Earth and its falling, or the releasing of objects into the air on planet Earth and their falling? How do we get the idea of that necessary connection or causal relation that will hold in the future? From what impressions is that idea derived? And that's what Hume is really trying to explore and examine in Enquiry, Section 7. Well, Hume writes that to say X causes Y is to say that X and Y are necessarily connected, such that whenever X occurs, Y must occur. If I say that the releasing of the pin on planet Earth causes it to fall, what I mean is that there is some sort of necessary connection between the pins being released and its falling, such that when the pin is released in the future, it will fall as well, right? When we're saying that there's a causal relationship between one event X and another event Y, we're saying that there's a necessary connection between them such that when the one occurs, the other will occur. Hume would want to make the point that we believe and say many things are necessarily connected, but we might wonder if this kind of talk is meaningful, right? And he wants to consider the source of meaningful causal discourse in section 7. It seems to me that Hume wants to say that if this talk of causes or necessary connections is meaningful, then there must be some impressions from which the ideas of necessary connection is derived. This prior claim hinges on Hume's theory of meaning that he articulated in section 2 of the Enquiry. In section 7 of Hume's Enquiry, he goes looking for the impressions from which we derive the idea of necessary connection. Now, ultimately, Hume will give his own view about where we get the idea of necessary connection. Ultimately, he'll give his own view about the impression from which we derive the idea of necessary connection. But he starts out by talking at length about some mistaken views about how we get the idea of necessary connection. So I want to talk about a couple of these mistaken views that Hume discusses. And I'm going to be overly brief here, but here goes. Some philosophers might think we get the idea of necessary connection or the idea of cause from the experience of seeing external material events occur, such as one billiard ball striking another billiard ball, leading to movement in the other ball. But these kinds of experience give us no idea of necessary connection. From the experience of such things in themselves, we experience no necessity. For all we know, the next time the one ball hits the other with the same force, it may cause no movement at all. At best, we only experience a constant conjunction of such events in the past, but not a necessary connection. While I've seen the cue ball strike the 8 ball, imparting movement in the 8 ball, I've seen this many times in the past. Cue ball strikes 8 ball moves. Cue ball strikes 8 ball moves, right? I've seen a constant conjunction of those two events in the past. Ball strikes, 8 ball, right? Cue ball strikes, 8 ball goes. I've seen that repeatedly, right? But here there's no experience in those events, which is an experience of necessity. For all I know, the next time cue ball strikes 8 ball just stays there. Or maybe the next time cue ball approaches 8 ball and just morphs right into it. And there's no movement. Cue ball disappears into 8 ball, all that we have experience of in the past is constant conjunctions between events. We don't have experiences of necessity between events. So this is the basis for Hume saying that we don't get an experience of necessary connections from our observation of external material events. Some philosophers might say, as does John Locke, that we get the idea of necessary connection or cause or power from the experience of our own will. This was clearly in Locke, in that chapter that we read by Locke, where he discusses freedom of the will, which is his chapter on power. The title of that chapter was Of Power by Locke, and he talks about this stuff in there. But some philosophers, such as Locke, believe that we get the idea of necessary connection or cause from the experience of our own will. When we will the movement of our arms or legs, they move, or we get it from the experience of our willing to think of some things and then thinking of them. But again, says Hume, we don't really get an impression of any necessary connection here by observing the activity of our will. At best, we only get the experience of a constant conjunction of the willing to think of something and then of thinking of it, or willing the movement of a limb and the limbs moving, right? According to Hume, we don't get an impression of necessary connection by reflecting on the operations of our own will, right? Right now, here's my arm. I will the moving of my arm. I will the raising of my arm, and my arm goes up. I maybe again I will the raising of my arm, and my arm goes up. But this is no impression of a necessary connection between the willing of my arm and my arms going up. Rather, it's just an impression of a constant conjunction between the willing of the movement in my arm and the arms moving, right? Or I might, right, sometimes we will to think of certain things. Maybe I want to, I don't know. Right now, I wish or I will to think of Madonna dancing. I'm old. The pop star Madonna. I will the dancing of Madonna on top of the Eiffel Tower. Now I can, and because I will it, I've got the picture in my head of Madonna dancing on top of the Eiffel Tower, right? I will it again, and there's the image again, the mental image again of Madonna dancing on top of the Eiffel Tower. But again, this is not an impression of any necessary connection or cause, an impression of a cause or a causal relation between my willing the experience of or the imagining of Madonna dancing on top of the Eiffel Tower. It's just the constant conjunction between my willing of that idea and the ideas occurring in my mind. And there's no experience of a necessary connection or causal relation here. All that we have the experience of between events, whether they are events of our willings and our doings, or external material events occurring, is the experience of constant conjunctions, but not of necessities. So where do we get the idea of necessary connection that gives rise, right? Where do we get, what's the impression from which the idea of necessary connection is derived from? And causality, what's the impression from which the idea of causality is derived? Well, Hume says the following. This is the correct view, says Hume. Hume wants to say that the idea of necessary connection, the idea of causality, is derived from the feeling of compulsion in our thinking. When we see events conjoined in our experience, then our mind feels compelled to expect one thing to happen after another. And this compulsion in our mind, the compulsion to expect one thing to happen after another, after having experienced them constantly conjoined in the past, that compulsive feeling in our mind, that is the source of our idea of necessary connection, says Hume. Right? I took note, page 361 of Hume's Enquiry, as perhaps containing a nice quote on this matter. Maybe I'll read a bit from Hume and then I'll let you guys go. Page 361, 3 lines down, Hume writes, "It appears then that this idea of a necessary connection among events arises from a number of similar instances which occur of the constant conjunction of these events, nor can that idea ever be suggested by any one of these instances surveyed in all possible lights and positions. But there is nothing in a number of instances different from every single instance of which is supposed to be exactly similar, except only that after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant, and to believe that it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. When we say, therefore, that, and I go down, when we say, therefore, that one object is constantly connected with another, we mean only that they have acquired a connection in our thought and give rise to this inference by which they become proofs of each other's existence, a conclusion which is somewhat extraordinary, but which seems founded on sufficient evidence, right? And so again, What gives rise to the idea of power, causality, necessary connection? Hume's view is that it comes from having experienced certain events constantly conjoined together in the past. Fire, pain, ow. Fire, pain, fire, pain. Releasing a pin, pin falling. Releasing a pin, pin falling, etc., right? Water heated to 212 degrees, boiling. Water heated to 212 degrees, boiling. When we see these events constantly conjoined in past experience, what happens is that our minds then feel compelled, necessitated to expect the consequence of the first event to be followed by the latter event. Given that I've seen the pin released many times in the past, I feel compelled to believe it will fall when released now, and lo and behold, it does. Having touched fire and been burned many times in the past, I'm compelled to expect that fire will burn me now as I put my hand towards it. It's from that feeling of mental compulsion to expect certain thing to happen in the future based on the experience of constantly conjoined events in the past. It's that from which we get the idea of a necessary connection or causal power or causality. And we don't get the idea sort of through reason. That's where it comes from, according to Hume. I don't have more for you today. That's my attempt to answer some of your interesting critical responses to Hume Section 4, and that's my spiel on Hume's Enquiry, Section 5 and Section 7. Hey, on Monday, I'll post a lecture on Hume Section 8, where he'll talk about freedom of the will and causal necessitation. And I'll also respond to student thoughts on Section 5 and Section 7. Group C, folks, you'll have a short assignment to do for Monday. Y'all have a good weekend. Bye-bye.